Chapter 60. Here at Shi Yan, Shuyi couldn't count the number of times this was the first time he had lifted a rock and shot himself in the foot. She took advantage of her own injury to test Shi Yan's bottom line step by step, and after finding out that he had no lower limit, she began to spread his wings, almost tantamount to playing a rogue. However, the facts have proved that Shi Yan never loses in fighting against Shuyi. Shuyi remained motionless in Shi Yan's arms, but his mind was running fast. Why did you suddenly want to live at his house? The main reason is that she thinks it's not good to live together so soon. No, isn't it? Are too many programs omitted? Why are the current CEOs so particular about efficiency? And think about it carefully, does her request have anything to do with living in his house? It was as if he would go home and eat 3 meals a day if he lived in the past. Yes, that's right. The case was solved. Shi Yan didn't want to fulfill his promise at all, he just brought private goods. How can you bear to play tricks with your girlfriend? Shuyi raised his head slowly, pushed Shi Yan away with a serious face, turned around and walked towards the office door without saying anything. With the attitude of my drama addiction is over, we go back to our respective families and find our respective mothers all over his body. Shi Yan grabbed her wrist. Where are you going? Shuyi still didn't look back. Try to make yourself look cool and calm. Go home and pack your bags. In fact, Shuyi never thought of refusing from the beginning to the end. She found that she seemed to be suffering from skin hunger, and when she saw Shi Yan, she wanted to make physical contact, even if it was just holding hands. She felt very happy. And looking at his own performance, it is estimated that in the eyes of Shi Yan, there is no reserve at all. It has always been the case when Shi Yan gave her a pull, and she could climb to the top instantly at the speed of a rocket. She lost the sick look she had when she came, and walked out with brisk steps, her long hair bouncing behind her back with her movements. But after walking 2 steps, she suddenly turned around. What's wrong? Shi Yan has already sat back behind the desk. Shuyi pursed his smile, his eyes shone like stars. She didn't speak, and trotted all the way back to Shi Yan, leaned over to him, and said softly, "It's nothing, I just want to kiss." Time banquet. There was no expression on his face, but he leaned back. A face of rejection. Shuyi got used to him holding it like this, so she took another step closer, smiled and tugged at his tie, just for a while. After finishing speaking, he leaned over, but Shi Yan turned his head slightly, making her miss. Shuyi. Her expression remained unchanged. She straightened up and looked around. Where's the wine? Do you have any wine here? Serve me wine. If you can't do it, you can just pour alcohol directly. Shi Yan didn't move, he just sat there and watched Shuyi's performance. Don't make trouble, this is the office. What happened to the office? Shuyi lost interest in an instant. There is no one else. Shi Yan, but I will react. Shuyi. She froze, turning around mechanically like a robot. While Shi Yan was sitting upright, the lenses reflected the light from the computer screen, and were coldly adorned on the frame, making his eyes particularly serious. Yes, he just looked at Shuyi so seriously. This person. How did you manage to say such things without blushing? Immediately afterwards, he loosened his tie without changing his expression, and said, if you don't mind, then come on. Shuyi's face flushed instantly, and she hurriedly went to get her bag. You'd better work hard. After finishing speaking, he turned his head and left without waiting for Shi Yan's answer. Walking to the door, she pressed the button to automatically open the door, but there was no response. Shuyi pressed a few more times, still the same. But she felt a scorching gaze sticking to her body, so she was embarrassed to turn her head to meet that gaze. He could only turn his back to the owner who was looking at him, and said, "The door to your office is broken." Not bad. The voice appeared beside her along with the footsteps. Immediately, Shi Yan hugged her from behind, and his aura slowly enveloped Shuyi. He lowered his head, and a light kiss fell on Shuyi's earlobe. It was just a superficial kiss, satisfying her request. But Shuyi could feel that he was indeed very restrained. However, in the next second, Shi Yan held Shuyi's left hand, pulled it upwards, and pressed the door open button on the wall. While holding her hand and pressing it down, there was a force behind her pressing towards Shuyi. For some reason, Shuyi's breathing suddenly tightened, and the sensory nerves in his whole body became 10 times more sensitive. Then, he just whispered in her ear, "You pressed it in the wrong place." Coming out of the office, seeing the staff coming and going, Shuyi lowered his head and hurried into the elevator. Obviously nothing excessive happened, but she felt an inexplicable guilt, as if everyone could see the uncontrollable imaginary images in her mind. It wasn't until entering the elevator that Shuyi breathed a sigh of relief. Her mind calmed down, and she finally felt throbbing pains in her injured fingertips. Back home, Shuyi, who could only operate everything with one hand, looked at the suitcase and fell into confusion. In fact, it's not that he can't take care of himself, and his left hand is not injured, but the pair of cosmetics in front of him has become the biggest problem. But due to habit, she couldn't go to work without makeup. While worrying, Tangy called. Shuyi turned on the hands-free and threw the phone beside him. While arranging the cosmetic bag, he asked, "What's wrong?" "I talked to the editor-in-chief today." Tangy said, "How to put it this way, it's very sad. We don't want such troublemakers to stay in the company." Hearing her tone, Shuyi knew that there was still a turning point. But at the end of the day, she didn't violate the commercial rules in the contract. Sure enough, as Shuyi expected, Tangy sighed. "Besides, she is also an old employee. If she is so merciless, it will hurt the hearts of other employees." Shuyi said twice. So I discussed with the editor-in-chief and made a decision. It just so happens that the spring recruiting is about to start. Next, transfer her to the branch office. Is it an explanation for you? In the end, what Su Yuling did was not unreasonable, and Shuyi had no intention of killing her. Transferred to a branch, the benefits and resources are far from those of the headquarters, let alone future career development. Shuyi naturally had no objection. She thought for a while and said, "Sister E, I'm going to take annual leave." Tang E, "What? Tell me what you think." "I don't have any ideas." Shuyi took out the cosmetics and only packed skincare products. "I have hurt my fingers, so I can't do much, and I'm very busy these days. I'm a little tired, and I don't want to see her, so I might as well take the opportunity to take my annual leave." Tang E was silent for a moment, then responded, "Then you go through the approval process." Shuyi took a total of 4 days of annual leave, including weekends, exactly 6 days. She packed the clothes according to the time she estimated. When Shi Yan came to pick her up, he looked at her 24-inch suitcase and asked, "That's all?" "That's enough." Shuyi told him, "I took a few days off, plus the recovery time the doctor said. It's about 6 or 7 days. Shi Yan glanced at her, said nothing, and walked out with the suitcase. This is the 3rd time at Xianjia. Shuyi told herself that this time, she came here as a girlfriend. She was justified and upright, and she should step out of the windy momentum under her feet with confidence. Then she dawdled for a dozen or so steps along the 2 or 3 meter entrance passage. Shi Yan pulled the suitcase, stopped suddenly, and looked back at her. "What? Why?" Shuyi asked in a low voice. "Didn't you have a lot of guts before? You dared to go to a strange man's house in the middle of the night." Shi Yan looked her up and down. "What are you afraid of now?" "What am I afraid of?" Shuyi puffed up her chest. "It's just my feet hurt." "Really?" Shi Yan looked at her legs. "Then I'll carry you in." "Why does it feel like there is a strange erotic feeling when I hold her into the house?" Shuyi passed him straight. "I'm not that delicate." Shi Yan looked at her back. A smile slowly spread from the corner of his mouth. Within 2 minutes of them entering the door, someone brought dinner. The kitchen of this house is clearly a display. After Shi Yan put the suitcase in the living room, he turned around and saw Shuyi standing with his hands behind his back. His eyes were looking around dishonestly, obviously nervous, and there was a trace of excitement. Shi Yan wondered if it was because he was thinking too much. "Time to eat." "Oh." Shuyi turned his head. "Okay." She took 2 or 3 steps to the dining room and sat down very dignifiedly. I don't know if it was to take care of her. The rice was specially boiled into porridge, and there was a spoon next to it. In front of Shi Yan was normal rice and chopsticks. But Shuyi didn't intend to be self-reliant. She raised her head and looked at Shi Yan opposite. In the past few seconds, Shi Yan had already picked up his chopsticks and began to eat slowly. Seeing that he didn't even look at her, Shuyi coughed. "How?" Shi Yan looked up. Shuyi looked at the food in front of him, raised his eyebrows, and signaled him with his eyes. Shi Yan followed her gaze to look at Kai, and said, "That's not green onion, it's wild rice." Shuyi, "Who asked you this? But isn't that really an onion?" She took a second look. "Why do they look exactly the same? They just look alike." Shi Yan explained to her patiently, "One is amaryllidaceae, and the other is a perennial bulb plant." Shuyi nodded, half understood. "Oh, that's it." Then suddenly came back to God. "I didn't tell you this. Did you forget what you promised me this afternoon? Did you just trick me into coming to your house? Shi Yan raised his eyes between meals, stared at her intently, swallowed the food in his mouth, and said unhurriedly, yes. Facing his straight eyes, I heard him say such shameless words frankly. Shuyi's reaction was very strange. Not angry, but a little hot. She didn't make any more noise, lowered her head, slowly picked up the spoon with her left hand, and turned the porridge in the bowl. At this time, Shi Yan suddenly put down the bowl and chopsticks, without saying anything, got up straight, walked around the table, walked to her side, pulled out the chair neatly and sat down, and then snatched the bowl and spoon in front of her. His series of actions were done in one go. Before Shuyi could react, he had already fed a mouthful of porridge to Shuyi's mouth. Shuyi froze for a moment, staring at him without blinking. Shi Yan was not in a hurry, and after looking at her for a while, he said, "Open your mouth." As if a switch had been pressed, Shuyi opened his mouth obediently. When a spoonful of porridge was fed, she even swallowed mechanically. The dining room was so quiet that only the light sound of the spoon touching the rim of the ceramic bowl and the breathing of the two could be heard. Although Shi Yan was feeding her, he kept looking into her eyes and never glanced at the bowl in his hand. Obviously, he was doing the most gentle thing, but his eyes were burning and direct, like scalding heat waves, coming from all directions, engulfing her bit by bit. Is this a meal? This is cannibalism. After a few mouthfuls, Shuyi couldn't take it anymore, and kept his mouth shut. Don't eat. That's still a little hungry. Shuyi took the spoon from his hand. I will do it myself. She lowered her head, mouth after mouthful, without raising her eyes. Shi Yan rested his temple on the back of his hand, tilted his head to look at it for a while, finally let out a chuckle, and then sat back to his original position. After a meal, it is not yet 8 o'clock. Shi Yan still had something to do, but instead of going to the study, he took his laptop and sat in the living room. Shuyi was also playing with her mobile phone in the living room, but when she saw Shi Yan coming over, she turned off the video and sat quietly to read the text. A few minutes later, she found that Shi Yan didn't seem to be very busy, and she was just checking some emails casually. So some people started to get restless. Shuyi, I'm a bit thirsty and want to drink, open a bottle for me. Shi Yan heard it, but still focused on the computer. A few seconds later, he got up and went to the refrigerator to get a bottle of water, and handed it to Shuyi without saying a word. Half an hour later, Shuyi, I want to eat oranges, and the doctor said I need to add more vitamins. The phone rang at the same time. It was from the assistant. Shi Yan turned on the speakerphone and leaned over to peel the orange while listening. Another half hour. Shuyi buried her head in the phone and her neck was sore. She stretched her shoulders and neck, then brushed her hair and said, It's a bit hot, help me tie my hair up. This touches the blind spot of Shi Yan a bit. He put down his laptop, stared at the rubber band that Shuyi handed over for a long time, and then raised his hand. Shuyi's back was facing him, her hair was pulled and hurt from time to time. Oh, take it easy. It hurts, take it easy. Although Shuyi kept talking about it, Shi Yan didn't say anything, just doing things that were completely unprofessional with a cold expression on his face. After spending several minutes tying a loose ponytail, Shi Yan didn't show any impatience, but he didn't say much, and started looking at the computer again. In his silence, Shuyi was condemned by a trace of conscience. After looking around the room calmly, she touched Shi Yan's forearm with her elbow. Then you are busy, I'll take a shower and sleep first. Shi Yan didn't raise his head. Yes. Shuyi, how could this person not understand her voiceover? I mean. Shuyi said in a low voice, Where do I sleep? Shi Yan rested her fingertips on the touch screen, looked at her sideways, and said clearly in her eyes, Are you asking nonsense? What do you think? Shuyi slowly turned her head away, fluttering her eyelashes, not panicking, but blushing a little. With such an expression, it was confirmed that she was just asking knowingly. Then I'm going to take a shower. She stood up and walked to the bathroom in 3 steps at a time. Bookish Shi Yan suddenly stopped her. There seemed to be a premonition that Shuyi stopped, but did not look back. What's wrong? The voice of the person behind him sounded neither salty nor weak. Did the doctor ever tell you that you need someone to help you take a bath? Chapter 61. She was so obedient just now, so everything was waiting for her here. At this second, Shuyi once felt that this was the thing he regretted the most. Even her fingers wrapped in thick gauze felt numb, and she even felt that she could dig out a hole in the ground with her own hands and bury herself. The doctor said. Shuyi still didn't turn around, but there was no trace of confidence in his voice. No, use it. Real. At some point, Shi Yan stood up, folded his arms, looked at Shuyi from a distance, and said with an obvious smile in his voice, "You need someone to feed you to eat, and wait for you to drink water. You can't even tie your hair. How can you take a shower?" Shuyi didn't know whether Shi Yan was serious or teasing her, so he tried to reason with him seriously. "It's fine not to touch the water. I went out to take a shower in the morning, so just a little casually." "How casual?" Shi Yan walked over step by step. "Is there no need to take off your clothes, or do you not need to apply body wash?" Shuyi. When words like remove and smear come out of his mouth, it feels like they are not simple verbs. I said no. Shuyi already had a tendency to become angry from embarrassment, but Shi Yan had no intention of restraining himself at all. "Then you don't like to be clean?" Yes, I just don't like to be clean." Shuyi walked away, although she didn't look back, but she felt that Shi Yan must be staring at her with an attitude of watching the show, so her pace became faster and faster. After a few steps, Shi Yan called her to stop again. "Shuyi, you really don't need to help me. If you call me later, I won't be so patient. Don't regret it." I said no need to help. Shuyi's mind was burning with embarrassment and anger, and he said decisively with the last bit of reason, "It's your son who repented. He even said that." Shi Yan looked at her fleeing back, with a smile on his lips, and returned to the living room. Half an hour later, Shi Yan turned off the computer and prepared to go back to the room to take the pajamas and wash up. The bathroom is built into his room. When passing the steaming bathroom, the door lock clicked softly. He heard footsteps and looked sideways at the bathroom. A few seconds later, the door opened a crack, and half of a head poked out. "Dad, time banquet." Shuyi can indeed take a bath alone. Anyway, she was planning to go to the barber shop to wash her hair tomorrow, so now she only needed to put in a little effort to wrap her hair into balls, then put water in the bathtub, and lay down with her arms raised. Everything is perfect. Even when she washed her underwear with one hand wrapped in a bath towel after washing, she felt that her left hand had unlimited potential to be developed. The idea was then met with Waterloo 2 minutes later. The set of pajamas that Shuyi brought was light and silky, outlining her body curves docilely. After she put it on, she looked at the mirror for a while, and then looked down at the undulations of her chest. Without the restraint of underwear, the shape is a bit too obvious. In the hot bathroom, Shuyi's cheeks gradually became hot. Thinking that Shi Yan was outside, Shuyi even felt that wearing pajamas in his spare time was no different from running naked. But she couldn't button her underwear with one hand. "When I packed my luggage, I put several sets away afterwards, and didn't think about it at all." So, after several minutes of inner struggle, Shuyi opened the door a little bit, and stopped Shi Yan with his head. Outside the door, Shi Yan looked at the half-flushed face in the crack of the door, and tilted his head. What can I do for you?" Shuyi clasped the door tightly with his fingers, and his voice was like a mosquito. "Help me button my underwear." Shi Yan really didn't hear clearly. He narrowed his eyes and moved closer. "What did you say?" Shuyi wasn't sure if he did it on purpose, but the inner struggle just now had given her enough psychological construction. "What's wrong with buttoning up your underwear? Isn't it just buttoning up underwear? It's not about asking him to take off on the spot and dunk with a backhand." So Shuyi turned around, faced Shi Yan with his back, and commanded loftily, "Button my underwear, hurry up, I'm sleepy." Shi Yan stared at her for a long while before coming over. Standing still for a few seconds, Shuyi's heart beat like a drum. When the clothes on the back were gently lifted, her limbs tensed up, and she stared fixedly at the blurred figure reflected on the wall in front of her without blinking her eyes. Shi Yan lowered his head, breathing on the back of her neck. The movements of the hands are delicate, but when looking at her naked waist from the corner of the eye, the hands will still inadvertently touch the skin on her back. With every movement, Shuyi became more nervous. However, Shi Yan kept silent the whole time, and after buttoning it up for her slowly, he lowered his hand and helped her tidy up her pajamas. "All right." Shuyi blinked his eyes in disbelief. He's actually quite human right now. For a moment, Shuyi coughed lightly. What happened? PTSD, caused by Shi Yan's non-human behavior these days. Obviously this is him. What's wrong? Shi Yan's voice sounded behind her. Anyone else need help? That's all, thanks. Shuyi hugged the clothes she had changed, turned around and ran into the bedroom. When Shi Yan turned his head, his eyes followed her voice, and when he saw her taking out bottles and cans and sitting on the bedside, he smiled silently. After completing a complete set of skincare procedures, Shuyi got into bed. There is a faint fragrance on the bed, which is very familiar and belongs to the banquet. Shuyi pulled up the quilt and covered half of his face, listening to the sound of water in the bathroom. He felt the air getting thinner little by little. She doesn't resist sharing the bed with Shi Yan, nor is she afraid. Ever since she agreed to live here, she has been mentally prepared. But at night, the nervousness still swallowed her psychological preparation a little bit. I don't know if it's because of the tension, the senses become more sensitive, and the throbbing pain in the injured finger also hits. Shuyi took a deep breath, turned his back to the bathroom, and slowly closed his eyes. After a while, the sound of water in the bathroom stopped. A few minutes later, there was the sound of the door opening. The room was covered with carpet, so no footsteps could be heard, but Shuyi could feel that Shi Yan was coming. I approached step by step until the edge of the bed collapsed. Shuyi closed his eyes tightly, but his eyelashes were trembling slightly. Suddenly, she felt Shi Yan's breath approaching, brushing against her ears. He propped up his upper body and looked down at Shuyi. After a long time, he suddenly said, "Are you nervous, or is your wound hurting?" Shuyi, that's right. She was tense and hurt. It hurts. Shuyi frowned, opened his eyes slowly, but still turned his back to Shi Yan. 10 fingers connected to the heart, and the heart hurts intermittently. Shi Yan looked at her hand outside the quilt. A layer of light yellow oozes from the gauze, and can smell a faint smell of plaster. Do you want to take painkillers? I've eaten it. Shuyi said, but it still hurts. Yeah. Shi Yan stretched out his hand and brushed the hair on her cheek. Then go to sleep, it won't hurt when you fall asleep. After speaking, he lay down, put his arm through her waist, and lightly held her left hand in front of her lower abdomen. A few minutes later, when the people behind her remained silent, Shuyi really relaxed and fell asleep with the sound of his own heartbeat. The moonlight on a spring night is covered with a layer of veil, gently covering the night sky. The breathing of the person behind him was calm and long, and his body temperature felt like a stick. Before he knew it, the corners of Shuyi's mouth curled up with the crescent moon outside the window. Yet the silence lasted less than an hour. When the heavy drowsiness hit, Shuyi was half awake and half subconscious, all of which prompted her to start looking for a more comfortable and warmer place. Then, when Shi Yan was half asleep and half awake, he suddenly opened his eyes. It was pitch black in front of him. He could only feel Shuyi turning around, one hand slowly climbing his waist, and getting into his arms little by little. But she didn't seem to find the most comfortable position. She twisted a few times, her chin kept rubbing against Shi Yan's chest, trying to stick her whole body against it. Shi Yan frowned in the darkness, his breathing rhythm was suddenly disrupted. And the person in his arms was still adjusting his posture restlessly. In the extremely quiet night, his eyes gradually adapted to the darkness, and he was able to see things in front of him clearly. At the same time, his senses were magnified. Shi Yan suddenly supported Shuyi's shoulders, turned over, and put his arms on her side. After staring for a moment, he bent down without hesitation. However, when the two breaths were intertwined, Shi Yan suddenly heard Shuyi's hiss. He paused, feeling his arm squeeze her fingers, and raised his hand almost subconsciously. After a second of stalemate, Shi Yan let out a long breath, and slowly lay down on his side again. He adjusted his breathing on the bed for a while. I don't know how long it took, but the tingling in my fingers continued. Shuyi half opened his eyes in a daze, and saw a faint light in the bathroom and the sound of water. She tucked in the quilt, closed her eyes, and fell asleep again. When she woke up in the morning, Shuyi subconsciously supported the bed and sat up. As soon as she exerted force on her hands, she immediately let out a soft cry of pain. Yet the room was empty save for the echo of herself. Shuyi's consciousness hadn't fully recovered yet, and after looking around for a while, he slowly realized that this was Shi Yan's home. However, the banquet was not there. Shuyi immediately got out of bed and glanced at the bathroom, but there was no one there. She went outside and called Shi Yan twice, but still no one answered her. At this time, she looked up and saw the display on the clock cabinet. It turned out that it was already 9 o'clock. No wonder Shi Yan wasn't here, he should have been sitting in the office by this time. Thinking of this, Shuyi suddenly relaxed a lot, and walked back to the bedroom swaggeringly. After lying on the bed, he took out his mobile phone and found that Shi Yan hadn't sent her a message. Shuyi snorted coldly, crossed his legs, and made a phone call. After a few rings, the opposite side picked up. Woke up, that's right. Shuyi said, when did you leave? Time banquet, 8 o'clock. Shuyi opened the curtain casually, and the sun poured in. Oh, so early. By the way, I suddenly remembered, did you get up to take a shower in the middle of the night last night? Because Shi Yan's tone was quite relaxed, Shuyi thought he was idle now, so he couldn't help but want to say a few more words to him. However, the fact is that Chen Sheng and 3 secretaries are standing in front of Shi Yan. Really? Shuyi asked again without hearing Shi Yan's answer, or am I dreaming? Shi Yan, you are dreaming. Oh. Shuyi murmured, that's right, what normal person wakes up in the middle of the night to take a shower? Okay, I'll sleep for a while, you are busy. After hanging up the phone, Shuyi looked at the ceiling and started laughing out of nowhere. But laughing and laughing, she suddenly couldn't laugh anymore. She turned her head away, just in time to see herself reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everyone slept on his bed openly. As a result, don't talk about anything else, not even a kiss. Shuyi sat up slowly and touched her face. Just at this moment, Bai Ruoshan sent a message to Shuyi. Bai Ruoshan, damn it, Shuyi has been dealt with. I'm going back on the plane tomorrow. Shuyi, oh. Bai Ruoshan, are you busy? If you are not busy, I will come to your house in the evening, and we will make hot pot by ourselves. Shuyi, I'm not busy, but I'm not going home. Bai Ruoshan. Shuyi, I live in Shi Yan's house now. Bai Ruoshan. TSK, that's fine, but you're living together quite quickly, and you're planning to take maternity leave at the end of the year. Shuyi was silent for a while, then frowned and typed, let me tell you, we slept on the same bed last night. Bai Ruoshan, that's enough, I don't want to hear this, if you go on, I'll report it. Shuyi, then nothing happened. This time it was Bai Ruoshan's turn to be silent. After a while, Bai Ruoshan, option A, you are too unattractive. Option B, he can't do it at the time. Shuyi, I think it is impossible for me to be unattractive. Let's rule out this impossible answer. Bai Ruoshan, so the answer is B. Chapter 62. After literally reaching an agreement with Bai Ruoshan, Shi Yan suddenly sent another message. Shi Yan, there is breakfast in the kitchen, heat it yourself. Shuyi looked at his chat box and couldn't help laughing. After a while, she got up and walked to the kitchen. After breakfast, Shuyi went back to her room, only to see Bai Ruoshan's message a few minutes ago. Bai Ruoshan, although option B is absurd, it is even more absurd for a man in his 20s to sleep on the same bed with his girlfriend as if he were an old monk. Bai Ruoshan, ha 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 ha. Seeing the series of ha-ha, Shuyi typed with a cold face, is it funny? Bai Ruoshan, it's not funny, I just love you, ha ha ha. When spring returns to the earth, tender willow buds are the first to know. Shuyi sat on the balcony, opened the bed, let the sun shine on her body. It was difficult to close her eyes and feel the warmth of the early spring. Originally, she was just joking with Bai Ruoshan. But after calming down and thinking about it carefully, I actually thought, she. Explain, have to. Very have. Road reason. With Bai Ruoshan's rhythm, Shuyi was a little distracted throughout the morning. After lunch, she watched TV for a while, still thinking about the question of whether Shi Yan would work or not. In order to let himself stop thinking about it, Shuyi took the computer to sit in Shi Yan's study, and pulled out some of the information he had collected a while ago. A total of 3 GB of text and audio materials have been stored in this folder for a while, and she wants to take advantage of these few days to sort them out, but after trying for a while, it is really inconvenient to operate the mouse and keyboard with the left hand. Wasted several times the time. After an hour, Shuyi sat cross-legged on the sofa, and passionately insulted Su Yuling for a while. Turning around, she went to act like a baby with Shi Yan. Shuyi, I can't use the computer, I can't type, and I'm just sitting in the living room by myself. I'm so miserable. She said this without any purpose, she just wanted to talk to him when she couldn't see him. However, Shuy's want to hug emoji hadn't been sent yet, and Mr. Shi, who was extremely efficient, quickly replied with a solution. I asked Qin Shuriwa to come and help. Shuyi, Shi Yan, you are pressing my head and asking me to choose B. Shuyi was a little depressed for a while, and accepted the arrangement of the banquet. That's okay, at least it won't be boring if you have someone to accompany you. But Qin Shuriwa didn't think so. She was originally in the coffee shop downstairs of Yu's company, and she was ready to meet by chance at any time. Being called here suddenly, who has considered her mood? When she rang the doorbell, she looked unlovable, but she didn't forget to call little aunt. Thanks to Shi Yan's blessing, he suddenly grew up a generation. Shuyi was a little flustered, and hooked his fingers at Shuyi. Come, seeing Shuyi's hand, Shuyi asked in surprise, what happened to your hand? It's okay. Shuyi walked slowly towards the study. I accidentally got hurt by the door. Is it all right? What's the big deal? Don't be so coquettish. In the study, Shuyi looked at the densely packed digital current professional materials in Shuyi's computer, and almost fell into a coma. Although Shuyi was sitting next to her, directing her to do things, and introducing and explaining to her, it was still a catastrophe for Shuyi. If it wasn't for the consideration that Shuyi really needed help, Shuyi might not wait until the first month to get her hair cut. The most irritating thing was that she worked as a typist for Shuyi all afternoon, and when Shi Yan came back in the evening, she glanced at her with her patrolling eyes, and said calmly, you can go home now. Shuyi, working for your wife all afternoon, not even a meal. Shi Yan seemed to understand Shuyi's eyes, but he didn't have any intention of introspection. Shuyi finally left cursing. When the third person disappeared, Shuyi put his hands behind his back and stood at the dining table watching Shi Yan for a long time. The setting sun melted gold, sprinkled on Shi Yan's face through the glass. His outline was half hidden in the light and shadow, and when he raised his hand to fiddle with the bowls and chopsticks, he looked focused as if he was dealing with a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars per minute. But Shuyi inexplicably began to lose his mind. Looking at his face, remembering what he had said and done. In my mind, I frantically wandered back and forth between option A and option B. As if sensing Shuyi's gaze, Shi Yan looked up at her. Sit down. Shuyi nodded and walked around the table. Because her thinking was a bit off and her attention was distracted, she subconsciously used her right hand to pull the chair. The moment she exerted force, she frantically shook her hands in pain as if she had been scalded. Shi Yan frowned at her, stretched out his hand and pulled the chair away. What are you thinking? I was thinking. Shuyi covered his hands, looked at him, his voice gradually became softer, but he was very direct. Can I sit on your lap? Shi Yan's movements paused, his brows were still furrowed, but he said indifferently, no. Shuyi reluctantly sat down on the chair beside him. Why? Shi Yan picked up the spoon and stirred the soup in the bowl. So you won't be able to eat dinner today. Shuyi looked at him blankly. It's the first time I hear this, I blush and my heart beats. But listening to it today, there are only deep doubts. Are you only good at talking? After a moment of silence, seeing that Shi Yan was not loose at all, Shuyi suddenly squeezed into his lap and sat down, wrapping his arms around his neck. I want to. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Shuyi clearly felt that Shi Yan's eyes had changed. He looked down at her with a calm face, but there seemed to be waves and undercurrents in his eyes, and even the rhythm of his breathing began to change imperceptibly. However, the next second, Shi Yan regained his expression and picked up the bowl and chopsticks. Whatever. Although some people made it seem scary, the meal went through without incident. Varied, what? All without. Hair born. Shuyi wiped her mouth with a tissue, but her eyes frequently glanced at Shi Yan. With such a clear gaze, it is impossible for Shi Yan to be without gaps. He rolled his eyes and said casually, what are you looking at me for? Shuyi rolled his eyes and said vaguely, it's nothing. I said I was looking to see if you could do it, would you believe me? After the meal, Shuyi hugged the pillow and nestled on the sofa, watching Shi Yan enter the study. For 2 full hours, Shi Yan was working without any movement. Until Shuyi came out of the shower. This time, she made a decision. No more underwear. After lightly knocking on the door of the study, Shuyi leaned his upper body in when he heard the answer from inside. I am going to sleep. Shi Yan let out an and turned his head casually, his eyes suddenly paused. Under the bright light, Shuyi was wearing pajamas with long sleeves and trousers. But the placket was not fully buttoned. Because he had just taken a shower, his skin was white and shiny, but his collarbone was red. Look down, the curve of her chest faintly rises and falls with her breathing. The study suddenly fell into extreme silence. Shuyi grasped the door frame tightly, and the sound of breathing was clearly visible. She saw it. She saw that Shi Yan's eyes had clearly changed, and she looked at her with burning eyes. Like a normal man. But the next moment, Shi Yan frowned slightly, withdrew his gaze, and turned to look at the computer. Remember to take painkillers before going to bed. That's it. Shuyi returned to the bedroom in disbelief, lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling in a daze. This night is the same as yesterday. After taking a shower, Shi Yan fell asleep, and said a few words about her injury. Then I fell asleep. This caused Shuyi to think that option B was just a joke, but now he started to take it seriously. The next day, the temperature rose again. It happened that Shuyi was going to change her medicine. After leaving the hospital, she asked the driver to take her back to her home first. After tidying up some thin clothes, Shuyi looked at the silk nightdress in the closet. Two-piece set. The outside is a normal nightgown, and the inside is a suspender nightdress of the same color. She thought for a moment, grabbed it and stuffed it into her bag. Probably because there was a conspiracy, and this conspiracy was a bit difficult to tell, so Shuyi was particularly quiet today. After Shi Yan came back, she ate dinner in a proper manner, and then the two of them went about their own business. Because of her evil intentions, she didn't even go to the study to harass Shi Yan. As soon as I arrived, I took a shower, and then put on her sexy suspender nightdress. After all, it was very revealing clothes. Shuyi didn't have the nerve to really wear them in front of Shi Yan, so he got under the covers as soon as he came out of the bathroom. After waiting quietly for more than an hour, Shi Yan was finally ready to sleep. When Shuyi felt him lying down, she silently clenched the bed sheet tightly. His breath came slowly, lingering around Shuyi. He seemed to be very tired today. He stretched out his arms to embrace her as usual, and then closed his eyes. Shuyi turned around slowly and leaned into his arms. He didn't move, only his arms tightened a little. Shuyi looked at his chin, breathing lightly over his Adam's apple. She raised her head and kissed his chin lightly. A little itchy, a little tender. Shi Yan still had his eyes closed, but the corners of his lips were slowly curled up. The body temperature of the two gradually blended in the embracing posture. Lying on his side like this, Shuyi's hands were inconvenient, but he stretched out his feet slowly, with the tip of his toes across his calf. In the dim light, Shi Yan just frowned, gently caressing Shuyi's back with his arm. Don't move, sleep, good boy. In the peaceful night, Shuyi took a deep breath. The fist under the blanket was hardened. I think her Shuyi is as beautiful as a flower, and everyone praises her. She was reduced to the point of actively seducing her boyfriend by relying on her looks, and the seduction failed. At that time, someone could no longer be a stone hammer. After calming down for a few minutes, Shuyi suddenly pushed Shi Yan away angrily and turned his back to him. Shi Yan asked in the dark, "What's wrong?" "It's okay, I'm hot, stay away from me." Wearing suspender pajamas in a vacuum to seduce Shi Yan is already the most daring thing Shuyi can do. This failed. Probably this man is really indifferent in that regard. He has no desires. Maybe he can climax just by looking at the money in his account every day. Shuyi no longer has any thoughts about him, and is even ready to embrace Plato. With such psychological construction, Shuyi gradually became indifferent. Wear whatever you want, lie down however you want, anyway, he won't react. Both of them strangely entered into the mode of old married couple. Usually, when Shi Yan was about to go to bed, Shuyi had already taken a shower and was lying quietly in her pajamas, looking at her mobile phone. It didn't matter whether there was another person beside her or not. After 5 or 6 days, Shuyi's fingers were much better. I went to the hospital to remove the gauze, and the doctor only applied a thin layer of medicine. The blood on the nail bed turned from red to purple, and it looked a little inexplicably sexy. As for Shuyi, as long as he doesn't squeeze his fingers, it's not a problem to hold something light, let alone typing or using a mouse. It just so happened that there was an entertainment at Shi Yan that night, so Shuyi and Qin Shiriwa went out for dinner together. It was almost 9 o'clock when I got home. She took a shower and felt a little cold, so she put on a bathrobe over a suspender skirt and sat in the study to check emails. She has to go to work tomorrow, and she has to start sorting out the accumulated work. Unknowingly, an hour passed and it began to rain outside the window. Shuyi rubbed his neck, and the small WeChat icon at the bottom of the screen flashed. By Ruoshan, absolutely, I heard something today. Shuyi, what's wrong? At night, Bai Ruoshan was naturally going sip. Shuyi chatted with her and forgot about the business. Until the study was opened by Shi Yan. After Shuyi typed a string of words, she turned around and said, "Are you back?" Shi Yan looked at her deeply, and said N. Shuyi gave a hutch, stood up and walked out. Then I'm going to sleep. When passing by him, Shuyi smelled a faint smell of alcohol. She stopped suddenly. You've been drinking. Shi Yan, 1 point. Oh, Shuyi continued to walk out, then go to bed early. Back in the room, she lay on the bed, changed her mobile phone to send messages to Shan. Shuyi, stop talking, I'm going to sleep. Shan, so early. Shuyi, is it early? It's almost 11 o'clock. Shan, you didn't go to sleep until early in the morning. Shan, oh, did you have sex today? In the study, Shuyi's computer was turned off. Shi Yan took off his coat and sat down. Just as he was about to help her close the computer, he suddenly saw a WeChat dialog box on the screen, and a line of words jumped out. No, immediately afterwards, the conversation continued. Ha 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 ha, is it true? You haven't had sex after sleeping in the same bed for so many days. Speechless, it's useless to seduce me in pajamas. Ha 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 sister, you have failed too much. What does it matter to me? He can't do it. After complaining to Shan, Shuyi didn't immediately put down his phone and go to sleep, but switched to Weibo and casually swiped. When Shi Yan came in, she didn't even give him a look. But from the corner of the eye, he saw Shi Yan standing in front of the bed undoing his tie. He always wears a shirt and trousers on weekdays, which perfectly outlines his figure, and looks deserted and otherworldly. But every time he untied his tie, Shuyi couldn't help but take a second look. With a tightening of the fingers and a pull of the arm, it was like tearing off the disguised gentle mask, and the man's aggressive nature was fully revealed in that every move. However, when he tore off his tie and threw it on the bed, Shuyi looked away and asked, "Are you going to take a shower?" Shi Yan, don't wash it yet. Oh, Shuyi didn't care, brushed his hair, and returned his attention to the phone. Suddenly, Shi Yan sat beside her, took off her glasses, took her mobile phone away, and put them together on the bedside table. Shuyi. Then, the belt in front of the lower abdomen was untied, and the nightgown was peeled off by him. Shuyi. Before he could react, Shi Yan had already overwhelmed him. Shuyi. The scorching breath came overwhelmed by the smell of alcohol, and Shuyi was robbed of his breath in an instant. He inserted his fingers into her hair, supported her head, and kissed passionately, even a little roughly. Everything happened so suddenly, Shuyi had no preparations, and subconsciously put his hands on his chest. She wanted to respond to his kiss, but she couldn't resist at all. Sobbing involuntarily, she could only let him occupy all her consciousness violently from between her lips and tongue. Lingeringly, Shuyi's hands slowly slid up and hooked his neck. It was also at this moment that the skirt was suddenly lifted up. Shuyi suddenly opened his eyes wide. What came into view was Shi Yan's eyes full of desire. It is staring at and seducing. Looking straight at her, his lips softened, and he bit her lightly, but his hand caressed Shuyi's lower abdomen, slowly moving upward as if teasing her. Shuyi gasped suddenly, and his whole body trembled instantly. What is this sudden car? Before she could recover, Shi Yan kissed him again. His palm was only warm, but Shuyi felt that every inch of his skin was burning and trembling wherever he passed. Shuyi's mind was pounding, the world was spinning in front of her eyes, and the chandelier seemed to tremble along with her body. You. Her cheeks were flushed, her mouth was half opened, but she couldn't utter a complete sentence. Shi Yan's movement stopped. He propped one hand on Shuyi's side, stroked her cheek with the other, and lightly brushed the corner of her lips with his thumb. I feel sorry for you, and I'm afraid that when I can't control it, I will hurt your fingers. His voice was so low that it had the effect of bewitching. And you said I couldn't do it. Shuyi. She couldn't say anything, she could only blink again and again. Have I been pampering you too much? Because he didn't wear glasses, Shi Yan squinted his eyes, and without waiting for her answer, he kissed her earlobe again and again. I'm not. She clasped Shi Yan's shoulders with both hands, and the words she said didn't sound like her voice at all. I didn't come to listen to your explanation. Shuyi's breathing was no longer under his control, his chest heaved violently again and again. He couldn't even hear the sound of rain outside the window, only the sound of his own violent heartbeat. Don't look. The sound of the rain outside the window was getting louder, and the fallen leaves were sticking to the window wetly with water. In the chaos, Shuyi heard Shi Yan whisper, "Shuyi, you are so sensitive." As if sinking into a scalding spring, Shuyi's consciousness gradually became lax. She bit the fingertips of her left hand, opened her eyes dimly, and the waves of her eyes were ups and downs under the light. After a while, she reached out to Shi Yan. At her invitation, when he leaned over to kiss her hands wrapped around the back of his neck. The fit shirt was wrinkled and peeled off in the lingering, scattered messily on the bed sheet. Seldom do spring rains come so quickly and violently. She half opened her eyes, the dazzling light was shaking, and the curve of his shoulder muscles was moving closer and further away in front of her eyes. Shuyi felt that his consciousness dissipated and passed away in the collision again and again. She saw the redness in his eyes, the blue veins on his forehead, and the self in his eyes, like a leaf falling into the turbulent flow. Ups and downs, all follow him.
Welcome to Storyverse. If you have any novels you'd like to see or stories you'd like to share, feel free to leave us a comment or send us a private message. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community of avid readers and romance enthusiasts.
Chapter 63. The rain stopped quietly at some point, leaving only the faint chirping of insects hidden in the rustling wind, completely inaudible to the sleeping people. Indoor, Shuyi was lying on the pillow, her thin back was draped over her body in a mess, her long sweaty hair was scattered on the white pillow towel. Below the shoulders, half of the back is exposed, and the soft chandelier casts beams of light, making the red mark on the sphenoid bone particularly obvious. She opened her eyes and watched the hour hand beside the bed pointing to 2:30 in the morning. The flush on her face had not completely receded. However, the people on the side have not yet settled down completely. Shi Yan hugged her from her side and kissed her delicately on her back, bringing out bursts of itching like electric shock. In such a huge room, the air is very thin. Shuyi closed his eyes, his eyebrows trembled slightly, and he could smell the ambiguous breath with every breath. No more. She shrank back to the bed, pushed Shi Yan away with her backhand. I have to work tomorrow, you are so annoying. Shi Yan's kiss stopped on the back of her neck, brushing away the hair that was sticking to her face, and then stood up. Then go take a shower and rest. Shuyi was paralyzed and did not move. When she felt Shi Yan's hand touching her leg, trying to hug her, she sat up reflexively. Then he put on his nightgown carelessly, lowered his head and pushed him away before getting out of bed. I'll wash it myself, don't bother you. The feeling of inexplicable closeness, like an old couple that had grown up in the past few days, completely collapsed in this night. The moment Shuyi stepped into the bathroom and closed the door, the last of her strength was exhausted, her back pressed against the wall, and her sore waist and legs slowly slid down. Opposite the wall is just a whole piece of marble, which has the effect of a mirror under the bright bathroom light. Shuyi looked at his own figure reflected on the wall, and the scene just now flooded back to his eyes. She took a deep breath, raised her hand, and saw a circle of red marks on her wrist, and her breath became hot again. She couldn't help thinking about it. She was about to go crazy, so she pressed her palm against the wall, using the cold touch to fade away the hot feeling. It turned out that Shi Yan wasn't just flirting with her. But it's not entirely objective. It's not just sitting on his lap to react. Kissing, caressing, even just the lingering sensation on the neck is like a little flammable bomb. Even more incredible, Shuyi found that he was the same. Moreover, she felt that from now on, she would never be able to look directly at the title baby. Up to now, when she thought of Shi Yan calling her that on the bed, and what happened next, she felt a lack of oxygen. Every time he yelled, the more emotional he was, the more she would have to bear. But she was obsessed with the extreme tenderness when he called her that. He clearly knew that she would be bewitched, and would willingly satisfy his endless demands. Because she was really exhausted, Shuyi simply rinsed off and walked out. Back in the bedroom, she looked around, but Shi Yan was nowhere to be seen. A living person will never disappear in her own home, so she didn't care, but when she sat by the bed, she saw the things in the trash can, and her emotions were mobilized again. But no matter how ashamed to face it, she has to tidy up, otherwise the aunt who is doing housekeeping will come to see her tomorrow, and she will be even more ashamed. So when Shi Yan came in, he saw Shuyi squatting beside the trash can, sorting things out. He walked silently behind her. I'll do it. When Shuyi heard this, his hands trembled, but he sped up his speed. He tied the bag 3 times and 5 times, and then kicked it a little further away after getting up. Then pretending to be calm, he raised his chin and asked him, when did you buy it? Shi Yan tilted his head to look at it, as if trying to remember for a while, and then said, I don't remember. Shuyi felt that he might be embarrassed, although the possibility was very small. Then you really plan ahead. Shi Yan followed her feet, looked all the way to her eyes, and nodded naturally. Well, Xiao has missed you for a long time. Although this may sound a bit erotic, as long as you don't deliberately recall what happened just now, it is a compliment. So Shuyi raised his chin even higher. Then are you interested in me? Shi Yan, I thought the performance just now gave you the answer. Shuyi's chin retracted again. She knew that it was impossible for this person to be embarrassed when he was alone. In order to hide her embarrassment, she reached out and pushed Shi Yan's chest, but he grabbed her hand and pulled her into his arms. Being so close, Shuyi actually smelled a faint smell of smoke. Did you go to smoke just now? What's so surprising? Shi Yan lowered his head and rubbed his chin against her hair, with a sense of satisfaction in his voice. Don't you deserve an afterthought? Shuyi didn't expect that she could hear such a blunt and slightly obscene compliment from Shi Yan. But in this situation, she felt that his tone of voice was as sexy as when he called him baby. The second half of the night, for Shuyi, was a rare deep sleep in many days. In those few days, the two of them didn't break through the last level of intimacy, and Shuyi always restrained herself when she fell asleep in his arms. But now, she was drowsy fiercely, but she didn't forget to want to hug, cuddle, and coax unscrupulously. At the last second before her consciousness disappeared, she vaguely remembered that she was about to be attached to Shi Yan like an octopus. Under such circumstances, it was rare for the two of them to get up on time the next day. At dawn, Shi Yan stood in the cloakroom arranging his clothes, with a serious expression and a well-dressed appearance. And Shuyi half leaned against the table, watching him slowly put on his tie and watch with an appreciative attitude. When he turned around, Shuyi suddenly smiled and opened his arms towards him. Probably because he had seen this look too much last night, Shi Yan no longer needed to guess her intentions, so he went up to hug her and kissed her on the forehead. Shuyi smiled with satisfaction, then turned around and walked out with the same solemn expression as him. After all, she knew that as soon as she left this room, Shi Yan, this man must change his face in a second, and put on a look that we just sleep in the same bed at night but we don't know each other very well. Sure enough, when Shi Yan sat at the dining table, he was completely different from him at night. After several minutes, Shuyi couldn't stand the silence, and looked at him several times, but he didn't intend to talk. So Shuyi had no choice but to chat with the phone. She took out her mobile phone and took a look. Seeing that several people in the group were discussing something, she asked casually, I just read in the group of colleagues that Mingyu stopped lending to Qinyao Real Estate. Why? Shi Yan, strict loan allocation and capital utilization are the focus of bank risk control. Stopping loans to Qinyao Real Estate is a necessary measure that banks need to take to avoid financial risks. What do you think? Shuyi, I don't have any opinions, just want to listen to gossip. Those who didn't know thought that the two of us lay in bed last night discussing the bank's risk control measures. Nothing, then eat. Thanks to Shi Yan's ruthless operation at the dinner table, when Shuyi came to the company, no one would think that her tired face was because she was half tired in bed, and they would only guess which important person she was staying up late and working overtime for an interview outline, injured finger and asking for leave while still working so hard at home. Who wouldn't sigh that it's unreasonable to say that the meaning of the book is not read? After returning to work for the first time in 7 days, colleagues who were not busy all came to check on Shuyi's injury. It was not until the editor-in-chief arrived that the office area completely entered the working state. Let me tell you something. Holding the juice, Kong Nan moved over on the swivel chair and said in a low voice, when I got into the elevator this morning, I heard from Kenwei and the others that Su Yuling will be transferred to the Ningzhou branch in June. I know. Shuyi nodded. The editor-in-chief told me that day after I got home from the company. It's really because of that. Kong Nan looked at Shuyi in disbelief. Up to now, Su Yuling's private rumors have not spread in the company. Kong Nan thought that this matter has not been resolved yet, and the leaders are still deliberating, but he did not expect the result to come down long ago. It's understandable that the leader didn't say it out. First, he wanted the company to minimize irrelevant gossip. Second, he wanted to save some face for the old employees. Do you know, she told people that she wanted to change her environment, so she had to be transferred to the branch. Kong Nan rolled her eyes while talking. If I were you, she filed a complaint with her real boyfriend, and she still wants to leave decently. That's not necessary. Shuyi served coffee and clinked glasses with the juice in Kong Nan's hand. I'm already satisfied with this deal, and you think my boyfriend is from the underworld. Our magazine has nothing to do with him. Is it possible to find someone to beat her up? Kong Nan laughed dryly, and said with the corners of his mouth, what's the difference between your boyfriend's background and that of gangsters 100 years ago? The fishing time in the morning stopped here, and the two began to move bricks one after another. More coffee is consumed on Mondays, and most people are still sleepy on weekends. Coupled with physiological spring sleepiness, the whole office building is not as lively as usual. Until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The setting sun was setting, and the twilight was dark, and the sound of the keyboard one after another was very silent. A little girl who was usually a bit bluffed held her mobile phone and said oops. And then everyone's mobile phones in the financial group rang one after another. Shuyi was no exception, but she moved a little slower. By the time she finished reading all the news, Kong Nan had already cast her a gossip-hungry gaze. The news everyone received was very consistent, all from 4 or 5 photos posted by an ordinary person on Weibo. The person in the photo is Song Leland embracing a middle-aged man in the hospital. It's normal for such a popular singer with a secretive private life to instantly spark entertainment discussions, but it was the middle-aged man in the photo that really shocked the entire financial team. Shuyi stared at these photos, looking at them over and over again. His eyes went from disbelief to shock to pain, and he couldn't even speak. How could it be, Qin Xiaoming? The poses of the two in the photo directly hammered the ambiguous relationship between the two of them to death. In one of the photos, Qin Xiaoming was holding Song Leland with his arms around her waist. She and Kong Nan looked at each other for a moment, and after confirming the information in her eyes, she came back to her senses and ran to the balcony holding the phone. It took a while for Shi Yan to get through the phone. You, where are you? Shuyi's voice trembled slightly, and before he asked him if he had seen the news on the internet, he heard him say, I was in the hospital, and I had a car accident in Shuyi. Ah, what? After a wave of ups and downs, Shuyi exclaimed, why did the car accident happen? Where is the person? What's the situation now? No big problem. Shi Yan said, it's not serious. But Shuyi couldn't predict whether the calmness in his tone was natural or real. Which hospital are you in? Jiangqing People's Hospital. I am coming over now. Without even taking her bag, Shuyi hurried downstairs and hailed a taxi. After getting into the car, she was still as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. One is because of Qin Shuyui's situation, and the other is because the man hugging Song Leland in the photo is Qin Shuyui's father and Shi Yan's brother-in-law. At the same time, everyone else is concerned about how much Qin Xiaoming's sex scandal will affect Mingyu's stock price, while Shuyi only cares about whether Shi Banquet will be hit hard by it. After all, when she mentioned her sister that time, Shi Yan laughed so happily. 20 minutes later, the car stopped at the entrance of the hospital. Shuyi got out of the car in a hurry, still running all the way in high heels, and by the time he reached the 3rd floor of Building B, he was already sweating. Shi Yan was standing on the aisle waiting for her. Shuyi ran towards him, panting, and asked, Xiaoya, is she all right? It's okay, I just fainted from fright. The doctor has checked it, it's just a skin trauma. Shi Yan motioned her to look into the ward. In the viewing glass, Qin Shuyue was lying on the bed talking to the nurse. Shuyi finally breathed a sigh of relief. Shi Yan, I told you it's fine, why are you here in such a hurry? When Shuyi heard this, he wanted to stare at him. Do you think that everyone is as calm as you when they encounter things like you have taken the unfeeling pill? But thinking of another thing, she didn't want to stare at him. By the way, have you read the news? Shuyi thought that he must get the news sooner than her, so he didn't say it bluntly. It's President Qin who was photographed with Song Leland. Shi Yan was still so calm, I saw it. Shuyi, even this kind of thing, are you so calm? Shi Yan pulled her a little in front of him, looked past her, and after a brief glance, he remained silent. Maybe this is what people do after being hit. Shuyi can quite understand Shi Yan's pretending to be strong. She lowered her head, with mixed feelings in her heart. Shi Yan helped her by the shoulders, trying to make her look up. What's wrong with you? Shuyi, I'm just like you, it's also very difficult. Shi Yan, why? Shuyi was also shocked that the unreachable idol had such a relationship with her, and said to herself, I didn't expect that the closest distance between me and my idol was that she had sex with my boyfriend's brother-in-law. How could it be? How could it be Mr. Qin and Song Leland? Everyone said that she has both virtue and skill, but she actually did this kind of thing. She also said that she will always sing about love, which is ridiculous. Don't you feel your face hurt? Time banquet. He raised his head, looked at the woman behind Shuyi, and called sister softly. Chapter 64. Shuyi, who was immersed in shock and disappointment, felt even more indescribable when she heard Shi Yan's sister. She knew that Wyman, who lived in a simple way, had come. I didn't expect to meet Shi Yan's sister for the first time in such an embarrassing scene. She knew the feeling of being betrayed all too well. What's more, after so many years of married couples, once the dream was shattered, the scandal was exposed in front of everyone unexpectedly, and no one could accept this reality for a while. For those who are psychologically fragile, suicide is possible. But now, to Shi Yan's sister, she is still just a stranger whom she met for the first time, and she doesn't even have a place to comfort her. So Shuyi restrained his expression in front of Shi Yan before turning around slowly. The corridor of the hospital was as quiet as a mortuary, with a cool breeze blowing. 2 seconds later, Shuyi turned around again and buried her head in Shi Yan's arms. Although his eyes were open, the eyeballs did not move. If it wasn't for Shi Yan's chest rising and falling due to breathing, she might have thought she was dreaming. She patted her cheek twice, took a breath quietly, and turned her head away again. Because she was a little unconscious, she even felt that everything was an illusion, so she blatantly looked at the eyes, nose, and mouth of the woman in front of her. After reading it 3 times, Shuyi was sure that he was indeed hallucinating. The corridor of the hospital remained quiet for a long time, and it did not become lively because of the presence of 3 living people. Shuyi seemed to be turned into a statue, motionless, staring at the person in front of him without blinking. Until Shi Yan held her shoulders and said calmly, "Shuyi, my name is sister. Call sister. Elder sister." Shuyi finally blinked his eyes, stiffened from the soles of his feet to his neck, but his brain was shattered by dry lightning. Shihua is Song Lilan, and Song Lilan is Shihua. During these few seconds, she tried to empathize and compare her heart with her heart. If one day her father took Andy Lau to stand in front of her mother and said, "Wife, Andy Lau is actually the brother I always talk about, now I brought him here, are you happy?" What will happen to her mother? This underwhelming woman might faint on the spot. Although Shuyi felt that he was only a hair away from fainting on the spot, this strand of hair could barely support her voice. Elder sister. Those dry words make people suspect that she is the one who should be lying in the emergency room. Song Lilan nodded expressionlessly. Because she didn't know what kind of expression to put on after hearing the wonderful speech of the girl in front of her who had taken off her fan and stepped back. But in the next second, she heard the girl in front of her say, "You really look like Song Lilan." Song Lilan still didn't know what expression to put on, so she nodded again. "Well, that's what everyone says." Song Lilan's words once again pushed Shuyi's embarrassment to Mount Everest. She experienced a second social death. And it is still the kind of death that cannot be reincarnated. Suddenly, a nurse pushed open the door from the ward and leaned forward to signal Song Lilan to go in. She said she got it, and looked back at Shuyi and Shi Yan again, "Then I'll go in." Shuyi remained silent, except for Shi Yan's Song Lilan turned around and walked towards the ward. At the same time, Shuyi looked at the empty corridor in front of him, and said coldly, "Don't you have anything to tell me?" After Song Lilan heard it, she stopped suddenly, turned around and said, "Oh, yes. I'm married, and I forgot to tell the fans." Shuyi. She is asking about the banquet. After the door of the ward was closed, Shuyi slowly turned around and looked at Shi Yan. With the same expression just now, she stared at him blankly, as if she had lost her soul. At this time, Shi Yan, even though his niece and sister were still lying on the hospital bed and facing the biggest public opinion storm in their acting career, they still wanted to laugh. He reached out and stroked Shuyi's hair. Even in the hospital, he couldn't help but kiss her ear. "Why are you so cute?" However, Shuyi was not moved by this kiss. Her eyes were empty, and she said without emotion, "Is it funny?" If Shi Yan knew that his next answer would determine whether he would sleep in the living room or the guest room tonight, he would definitely not let a smile show on his face unscrupulously. In the ward, Shuyi saw Song Lilan coming in, and immediately felt wronged and wanted to cry. "Mom, I saw the news." She hung her head, choked up and said, "I'm sorry." Song Lilan let out a long sigh. "Silly, what are you sorry for me?" Originally, she spent a lot of effort to conceal her marital status these years, in order to give her family a normal life, and not want them to be influenced by her, and their every move would be watched by the entertainment media. But when she received a call and heard that Shuyi was unconscious except for a car accident, she couldn't control her privacy anymore, so she rushed to the hospital directly from the recording site of the show. It is difficult for someone who has not been a mother to empathize with what she has experienced during the half-hour journey. That's why when she heard the doctor say that Shuyi was fine, Song Leland was drained of all her strength like that person who broke through the gate of hell. At that moment, she didn't think about her star status, and she also forgot her behavior habits over the years, and couldn't help crying silently while hugging her husband in the hospital where people were coming and going. Naturally, no one can be blamed for being photographed. Soon, Qin Xiaoming also came in with someone. In less than 2 hours, the matter between Song Leland and him quickly fermented on the internet. So after confirming that Shuyi was fine, he was surrounded by calls from all parties. Even the calls of his assistant and secretary were almost blown up. At the same time, the traffic police and the driver responsible for handling the accident also came to the hospital. Shuyi was a real victim of this car accident. She had nothing to do in the afternoon, so she found an excuse to find Yu, but was rejected, so she planned to drive to relax. In the end, his heart was still there, but he was scared out of his wits by a retrograde driver who turned the wrong way. He turned the steering wheel and directly hit a big tree on the side of the road. When she woke up, she was already in the hospital. Fortunately, she just fainted from fright, and there was no physical harm. But when she woke up and heard that the accident was caused by the driver who was driving fatigued after taking medicine with a fever, she almost lost her breath again. The driver was a young man, and he was finally relieved to see that Shuyi was fine except for his pale face. But as soon as the traffic policeman mentioned the word compensation, the driver thought of the price of the damaged sports car, and suddenly lost his mind, shaking his hands and tremblingly pleading for himself. A big man started to cry while talking. Song Leland was very sad and didn't want to see this man. As far as she was concerned, as long as Shuyi was fine, nothing mattered. So she lowered the brim of her hat and waved her. "It's as long as you are fine, and I don't want to worry about other things." As soon as the words fell, Shuyi slapped the bed and got up. "Why don't you care about it? It's my fate that I didn't die." Could it be his luck? How did a person like him graduate from a driving school? Don't you know how to drive when you're tired? Why are you driving even when you can't keep your eyes open? I was not killed by him today, because I was young and quick to react. What if it is an old man in poor health? If you don't teach him a lesson, he will go out and harm people next time. Everyone in the ward, including the traffic police and doctors, was too shocked to speak. Everyone stared at Shuyi dumbfounded, and then heard the rich and powerful young lady say angrily, "Losing money. My car, my medical expenses and mental damage expenses. We have to pay for everything. Even if you sell everything you want, you have to pay 1 cent money. All no. Quite less." After Shuyi finished speaking, she was still out of breath, leaning on the pillow. Her chest could not be calm for a long time. Until she turned her head and saw Shi Yan and Shuyi at the door. And Yu, who didn't know when to appear. Realizing that her image as an exquisite little princess had collapsed, Shuyi slowly turned her head, closed her eyes, and chose to leave this beautiful world by herself. Since Shuyi had nothing serious to do, it was naturally inconvenient for the whole family to stay in the hospital. Qin Xiaoming stayed with Shuyi. Relatively speaking, Song Leland's public relations task was more urgent. When Shi Yan sent Song Leland away, many reporters had gathered outside the hospital. There are TV stations, newspapers, and entertainment reporters from all walks of life, with long guns and short cannons set up everywhere, causing pedestrians to turn their heads frequently. Song Leland was very experienced in dealing with such situations, and she would not let them find her trace, so she did not appear at the gate or parking lot at all. But Shuyi was not so calm. Not long ago, Shuyi thought that the hasty group photo at the airport was the only close contact between her and Song Leland in their life. After all, there seems to be a barrier between ordinary people and the entertainment industry. They are always in a screen that is within reach but cannot be touched. Sometimes it even makes people feel that they are actually living in another parallel space. In the blink of an eye, someone tells you that this well-known celebrity is your boyfriend's sister, the kind who has the same father and mother. It only took an hour to accept this reality, and Shuyi felt that he was already very up to date. So before Song Lilan got into the car, Shuyi finally remembered his belated apology. I'm sorry, sister. I said those things today because I didn't know you were Xiaoye's mother. It doesn't matter, those who don't know are not guilty. She turned her head and glanced at Shi Yan, but hasn't Shi Yan told you? Song Lilan didn't know that her reasonable question pushed her brother into the abyss of death with her own hands. The setting sun is like blood, surging in the sky like a slow-moving movie lens. After watching Song Lilan's nanny car drive away, Shi Yan raised his hand, trying to lead his girlfriend to the parking lot. However, as soon as he touched her fingertips, he was suddenly pushed away. Shi Yan didn't pay attention at all, and was pushed back 2 steps by her unexpectedly. He raised his eyebrows and looked at Shuyi. What's wrong? Still have the nerve to ask what happened? You are single right now. Shuyi turned his head and walked towards the gate of the hospital. His footsteps were so fast and imposing that Shi Yan really felt that he might be going cold. He chased after her and called her flatteringly, book meaning. Not only did Shuyi ignore him, but he took even bigger steps. Shi Yan reached out to pull her, but was thrown away without any surprise. Pull again, or be thrown away. Until Ren had already walked out of the hospital gate, Shi Yan held her hand hard, unable to shake it off at all. Shuyi stopped struggling needlessly, but he also stood still. She looked at the door across the street angrily, without giving the man beside her a look. Shi Yan looked sideways at her. Angry. Shuyi ignored it. There were people coming and going on the street, and based on Shi Yan's understanding of Shuyi, he might not know what she would do, so he said, let's go home first. Shuyi, I don't have a home. Time banquet. He sighed softly, and turned to stand in front of Shuyi, half bent, doing enough superficial kung fu to coax people. I didn't tell you about it at first, I just wanted to surprise you. It turned out to be a shock. Yeah, Shuyi sneered and looked away. Shi Yan stretched out his hand to hold her cheek, and rubbed her cheek lightly with his thumb. Don't be angry, okay? Shuyi still didn't speak, but looked over his shoulder and looked straight at a place across the street. She watched for a long time. Shi Yan's eyes moved slightly, and he asked, what are you looking at? Shuyi blinked, and seemed to be thinking seriously. I don't know if they will accept the boyfriend they don't want. Shi Yan followed her gaze and turned back. Across the street, in front of a dilapidated store, stood a huge job opening recycling. And a broken speaker that is playing in a loop closed broken rotten.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to our channel for more captivating illustrated romance audiobooks. Don't miss out on our latest releases and be part of our growing community. Hit that subscribe button and embark on an enchanting journey with us.